Hi, Anatol.
Hello.
How you doing?
Well, apart from the general situation, I could be worse.
Apart from the impending end of the world, things are fine.
Mm-hmm.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're Anatol Lieven of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, author of a number of books, including The Baltic Revolutions, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence, and most relevantly, for purposes of today's conversation, Ukraine and Russia, a fraternal rivalry. We're going to talk about the Ukraine situation, which seems to be getting more alarming almost by the hour. So today is the day that, first of all, I think is the last day of voting for the referendums in the 4 oblasts or provinces. It's widely expected that this will be followed by Russia's annexation of some or all of them, which will vastly complicate the prospects for near-term peace, I think, in your view and many others. And then the other thing that happened this morning, or I woke up to find it this morning, was the sabotage of not one, but both Nord Stream gas pipelines coming out of Russia. Now, why don't we talk a little about that first, because it's breaking. In the West, a lot of fingers are pointing at Russia. I don't quite get why Russia would do this. I mean, unless it's some kind of fancy false flag attack, because if they just want to stop the gas, there's a much easier way to do that, right? Because the gas comes from Russia to Europe, right?
Mm.
So what's your take?
Look, I just don't know. There is obviously an argument that Russia has done this by way of an excuse, not to resume gas supplies. Remember that, they've been using this excuse that the interruption of supplies was due to repairs to the pipeline. So it is possible that they've made this up.
Why would they not want to just admit that they're doing it on purpose for tactical purposes and say, after all, we're subject to sanctions, we're at war, this is what we're doing, we're cutting it off?
But look, I know. I mean, that's what I would have thought. But Putin does have a certain record of possibly going back to his Secret Service background of seeking plausible deniability that, in fact, is not very plausible. I mean, I suppose the Russians, of course, are claiming that Ukraine or Western intelligence services did it in order to make sure that Russian gas supplies cannot be resumed, so that to help discourage any possibility of Germany, in particular, in the winter, seeking a peace agreement with Russia in return for a resumption of supplies. I don't find that very plausible, but I suppose it's a possibility. I mean, the answer is we just don't know.
Yeah. I mean, a related thing I've never gotten is why Russia seems so happy about the prospect of not providing the gas, because after all, it gets money in exchange for the gas, right? I mean, it hurts both parties for them to shut off the gas, right?
Well, yeah, but I don't think Russia's happy with it at all. But it is, one of the very few means of pressure on the West that Russia has left. And, since the West, including the Europeans, are trying to bring maximum economic pressure to bear on Russia, this is the only way that Russia can retaliate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can imagine a false flag rationale if Putin is going to use this going to blame America or the West and use it to stir up pro-war sentiment in Russia or something. Conceivably, I don't know. Does it seem to you like this is a very worrisome thing in its own right? Could this contribute to a spiraling of things out of control?
Well, I mean, not if the Russians did well. I mean, the thing is, what I think is very obvious is that in the months to come, Russia will stand on the defensive on the ground militarily. Will seek to defend what it has while it trains more troops. I think that will be the case whether or not they move straight to annexation on Friday. While trying to put pressure on Ukraine by bombarding Ukrainian infrastructure. That has already begun, and threatening, to go after the Ukrainian government and political leadership as well. Well, but there the escalation is already in place, and of course, it must be noted that Ukraine has been sending people in to assassinate pro-Russian officials in eastern Ukraine.
Some territory that Russia occupies already.
Yes, exactly. Something that, of course, Russia regards as terrorism. And so the Russians would, I think, feel perfectly justified by now in attempting to go after the political leadership of Ukraine. But that would clearly mark a serious escalation.
Okay. Now, on the referendums, is it clear that Russia will take the outcomes of the referendums, and it's of course presumed that the results as presented, as officially tabulated, will be in favor of separation from Ukraine? I gather in some of the oblasts, maybe there's both a vote about independence and a vote about joining Russia, right? Whereas in two of them, the independence issue is thought of from Russia's point of view as a settled matter, right? In the case of Donetsk and Luhansk. In the other two, in the south, there's I gather separate votes on independence, on joining Russia. In any event, the presumption is that the officially tabulated results will be for leaving Ukraine. Has it been explicit whether Russia is going to take this as applying to the entire oblast, even though in some cases much of the oblast was not even part of the referendum because it's not occupied by Russia? Do we know?
Well, we don't. I mean, what we know is that Russia recognized back in February the independence of the two Donbas oblasts on the whole territory of those provinces, even though at that stage Russia occupied less than half of them and still doesn't occupy the whole of Donetsk. So we don't know exactly what Russia will do. We're not even absolutely sure yet that, although it seems probable, that the Russian government will move straight to annexation, because in the Donbas republics declared independence in 2014, but Russia did not recognize this independence until this February, on the eve of war, and in the meantime used those declarations as bargaining counters in diplomatic negotiations about the terms on which the Donbas would return to Ukraine. So I suppose there is a possibility, though only a small one, that Russia may do this again. Because if Russia does move, and we'll know on Friday, I think, when Putin is due to address Parliament, if he calls for immediate annexation, Parliament then obviously obeys and annexes, then that he really has burnt his bridges as far as negotiations are concerned, because there's simply no way that the Ukrainians and the West can negotiate, on the basis of agreeing, to Russian annexation of these lands. And at the same time, of course, if Russia has formally annexed them, it would be extremely difficult for not just Putin, but any successor government to give them up again, unless, of course, the Ukrainians have reconquered them already. So it would be, a colossal blow to whatever, slim hopes of peace remain.
Yeah, and if we presume that the results are taken to apply to the entire extent of the oblasts, it kind of commits Putin as a political matter to keep fighting until all that territory is actually acquired, right? I mean, leave aside peace negotiations. I mean, leave aside whether you and I think you're probably right. You can't imagine those once a lot of annexation has happened. But it will be politically unpalatable for Putin to even just kind of let the war simmer, right? I mean, am I wrong? Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it commits him to a whole lot politically, right? If he says, okay, these four oblasts are now part of Russia.
Well, it does indeed. But of course, Putin would not be doing this if he hadn't already given up on the hope that Ukraine or the West would offer what Russia could see as a reasonable compromise peace, because in recent months the Biden administration has declared over and over again that peace negotiations are purely a matter for the Ukrainians, and America has no say. And the Ukrainians have said, increasingly, that the only terms that we will consider are the complete, withdrawal of Russia from all the territories it's held since 2014, including Crimea. Well, no Russian government will agree to that. So, as far as I can see, the Russian analysis for the moment is there's nothing to negotiate. And so, I suppose, Putin is hoping to shift the whole Russian agenda and strategy, which has already, of course, changed and been scaled down greatly since February, but to shift it just to the mode of hanging on to what Russia now has.
Shifting it to that from what? What would you have imagined his end game was a few weeks ago?
Well, a few weeks ago, it still seemed, but let's see what happens on Friday. Perhaps he will repeat, his action in 2014 and wait. But the war started, of course, with Russia aiming to overthrow the government in Kiev, capture Kiev, replace it with either force it to submit to Russia or replace it with a Russian, puppet government, a client government. That failed completely. It was, of course, defeated. Russia did not deploy nearly enough troops for the purpose. So then the second stage was, Russia withdrew from around Kiev and concentrated just on trying to capture eastern Ukraine, and then only very partially succeeded at that. So now it seems after this, but until a few weeks ago, that was the Russian agenda to capture the whole of the Donbass. And I was told in Moscow, for what it's worth, not by senior government officials, but by people who have had close connections with government, that if Russia had managed to capture the whole of the Donbass, then Putin would have offered a ceasefire and peace negotiations.
That's what I thought.
They failed, even at that. Now, of course, Ukraine has launched this successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv. And as far as I can see, the Russian plan is now basically to dig in, recruit more troops, but of course they will take months to train and equip, rely on, artillery, and basically let the Ukrainians, as Russia hoped, batter themselves to pieces, attacking Russian positions, losing heavy casualties in the process, while Russia, for its part, destroys Ukrainian infrastructure. And, well, it depends on whether Russia annexes or not. If Russia doesn't annex, then, hope for peace negotiations at some stage, maybe come the spring. If Russia does annex, then peace negotiations as such are out of the question. But maybe sooner or later there will be a ceasefire. I have a feeling that what we may be heading towards ultimately is something like, the situation that's existed in Kashmir for 75 years now between India and Pakistan. There's never been a peace agreement on the fate of the province, but there have been a series of ceasefires lasting for years, but of course constantly interrupted by cross-border firing, terrorist attacks, and intermittent big wars. That seems to me the most probable scenario we're heading towards.
So if there is annexation, that's what you imagine as in a way, I guess at that point, the positive outcome compared to the alternatives, right? Because alternatives include ongoing escalation, things spiral out of control. You get either a regional war or a nuclear exchange. You're saying peace talks per se are out of the question if there's been annexation. So the kind of happy outcome is things just settle in more or less where they are, and the fighting cools to a simmer and is maybe kind of intermittent.
Well, yes, I mean, I wouldn't call it a happy option, but it's that would be better, obviously, than escalation towards nuclear annihilation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's. I want to get back to the issue of annexation and what slim prospects may remain for a negotiated solution if there's not annexation. But why don't we talk a little about Putin's domestic political situation, which of course is relevant to that, relevant to the question of whether he annexes. What is your take? I just saw right before we started taping that you've written a piece in The Guardian called If Putin Falls, but I haven't read it. So you can explain it to me as you're explaining to other people. For starters, I mean, it sounds like you're getting into the question of what would follow him on the stage. First, let's talk about how likely anything is to follow him. How precarious, if at all, do you think his situation is right now politically?
Well, I think it is clearly weakening. And I think another defeat on the scale of what has happened in Kharkov would lead a lot of people within the establishment to start thinking it was time for him to go. Because, of course, I mean, these people are anxious to protect their own wealth, their own positions. And if enough of them, went to Putin and said, deepest respect, it's time to go. Of course, it would be in some ways very like the deal, when Yeltsin stepped down and handed over to Putin, which is to say that the successor would guarantee Putin's wealth and his family position, immunity from prosecution, and any other top people who were forced, to leave as well, like the defense minister, they would also be protected. This, at least my view is that it's very unlikely that we will see, a revolution on the streets like Iran in 1978, 79. We might not actually see it as a coup at all. I mean, because Putin would appear to step down of his own volition. Remember that he has to stand for re-election in March 2024. So he could say, very like Yeltsin, I've decided, he might even, like Yeltsin, give a qualified, apology. I've decided not to run again. And as interim president, I appoint so-and-so. So there would be an agreed transition. Now, the advantage from the point of view of the Russian establishment would be that a newcomer could avoid, depending on who he was, of course, but at least some of the blame for everything that's gone wrong. But if the West wants, this to lead to an end to the war, well, the West would have to, make an offer of peace talks that Russia, could accept as a basis.
This is after there's a successor you're talking about.
Well, yeah, because no Russian government can surrender Crimea. Even now, it's right. Just a non-starter. That's not going to happen. But of course, this is where the question of annexation becomes so crucial. Because if in the meantime Russia has annexed these territories, then it's not clear that there will be anything to talk about with a successive government. At which point, the successor to Putin might well, blame Putin for everything that's gone wrong, but say to the Russian people, but, given that the West has now taken sides completely against us, and given that, they are not prepared to offer a compromised peace, we have no choice but to double down and go on to the end, so wider conscription, all people into the military.
So it sounds like you're seeing the pressure that could lead him to exit the stage as coming from kind of the nationalist hawks. Of course, the other side of the political pressure on him now would seem to be people who oppose the war. I haven't seen signs of kind of massive demonstrations. I mean, Dagestan looks a little unruly, but that's as far away, as you can get from him. And it's not a huge place and so on. So is your take that he does not, I mean, of course, there are rampant hopes in the West that that's what he has to worry about, right? The rebellion of liberals. And so finally we get a government to our liking. It sounds like you don't think, I mean, that's probably part of the equation if people are deciding whether to get rid of him, because I'm sure they'd like for the whole country to calm down. But it doesn't sound like that's where you see the big pressure is coming from.
There is pressure from the streets. Obviously, there is great pressure from these scenes of mass evasion of service and people fleeing the country. There is a pressure from the worsening economic crisis, but I mean, all of this is worsening Putin's position. I think it would have to get a lot worse to force him to step down. But he may, as I say, he may decide to step down, more or less of his own volition. I mean,
that doesn't sound like him. I mean, I'm not an expert. It just doesn't. A graceful exit doesn't. He seems somebody who holds on to things pretty tenaciously. Am I?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But then again, some failures are simply undeniable. And, so far, the Russian war has overwhelmingly failed. And he is personally responsible for it. I mean, as to who will, what the character of the government that succeeds him, I mean, that will depend, as I say, on whether Russia annexes on Friday. But if it doesn't, I mean, if there's still a chance of negotiation, it will also depend on us, on whether the West, and it would have to be the United States, offers peace terms. Because if they do, then it would be easier for a successor to Putin to accept, drastically scaled down gains, because he wouldn't have been the man who launched this disastrous war. But of course, we have to be prepared to offer something that Russia can accept.
Okay, so we will know. You think by Friday, if he plans to annex, and I mean, I suppose in your dream world, in between now and then, the West would signal that it is willing to talk about negotiations, but you don't, because that could well forestall an annexation decision, I would think. But you don't imagine that happening.
The Biden administration has boxed itself in by declaring that negotiations are purely a matter for the Ukrainians, and the US has no say, which is a ridiculous position given that the US is, arming the Ukrainians, funding the Ukrainians, and of course running very great risks for the sake of the Ukrainians. So to suggest that America has no say in the negotiating process is an abdication of responsibility to the American people. But that is the unanimous line of the Biden administration. And meanwhile, the Ukrainian government, which soon after the war began, made a very reasonable set of peace proposals. But of course, since then there have been Russian atrocities. There's the extra bitterness created by war, and there have been Ukrainian successes. So in recent weeks, you've had more and more people, including Zelensky, saying that the only terms of peace that Ukraine will accept is the complete reconquest of all the lost territories, including Crimea, which basically excludes any possibility of peace. So, in an ideal world, yes. This is the moment for the West to come out with a really strong peace initiative. But I fear it will not happen.
Mm-hmm. Now, in Putin's mobilization speech, he alluded to the kind of tentative discussions in March that might have led to peace. And I think you find in that a ray of hope. It suggests that, maybe that was a signal on his part that he's willing to talk about that. He also said that those talks were basically sabotaged by, I think, the U.S. and Britain. And of course, that's been something we've heard for some time. People have said Boris Johnson went there with a message in the spring and kind of and the intent of putting an end to any talk of negotiations. Do you have a take on that? Do you think Putin is just this is kind of propaganda, or do you think there's reason to believe the Western powers have been pressuring Ukraine not to talk about peace?
Well, I mean, it's certain that Johnson opposed any peace deal. Whether that was also the view of the US government, I don't know. What I think one can say is that given the domestic pressure that Zelensky was under from his own hardliners, to get the Ukrainian government actually to press ahead with peace would have taken full support from the US. Mm-hmm. And it was clear that he didn't have that. So maybe, the US blocked it simply by not doing anything. The Ukrainians say, of course, and this, by the way, is not mutually exclusive. This could also be, both of these things could be true, that the Russian atrocities around Bucha that were discovered when Russia withdrew from that territory were what led the Ukrainians to drop their peace proposals. Mm-hmm. And there may be, an element of truth in that as well.
Yeah. I have one question about one more question about the referenda. It's assumed in the West that it will take crooked vote counting for independence and or joining Russia to carry the day. Do we know that? I mean, one thing that I gather has happened is that, there's been a lot of exodus from a lot of these places, and the people who've tended to leave, I assume, have tended to be the pro-Ukraine people, right? Now, I have no idea what the mixture was of allegiances, and I know it's shifted over time, but what do we have a sense for what the actual sentiment in these various places is right now?
Not really. It's very difficult because investigating under circumstances of occupation is very difficult indeed. All we know is that before the war there was considerable pro-Russian sentiment in these areas. But as you say, now most of the pro-Ukrainian population may well have fled, but on the other hand, of course, one can imagine that the local people, having been, bombarded and in some cases had their cities destroyed by Russia, are not feeling, even the ones who remain are not feeling very pro-Russian. I mean, I think just the thing to point out is that in these circumstances, you cannot possibly have a free and fair referendum, mm-hmm. and so the results, whatever may be the real sentiments of the majority of the people, the results will lack all credibility and legitimacy. That, by the way, was not true of the referendum in Crimea back in 2014, where a large number of independent witnesses said that, to judge by their observations and interviews, the result of the referendum, which was to join Russia, was actually correct. It did reflect the will of a majority of the people. But then, of course, that was in a time of peace. The Russian takeover had been completely peaceful. There were no refugees. So, it was a quite different situation.
Mm-hmm. On the mobilization, do you have a sense for what the chances are of it succeeding from Russia's point of view in the long run? I mean, as you say, it's not going to work any miracles over the next few months. These people need to be trained and so on. The whole mobilization machinery needs to be built. But can you imagine Russia being kind of in the driver's seat in the spring militarily? And if so, what do you think their goals would become militarily?
Look, I could be wrong. I mean, the course of this war has surprised everybody. Western analysts, obviously the Russians themselves. I find it difficult to believe that, with poorly trained, quite likely poorly equipped, and quite likely discontented conscript troops, Russia will be able to resume the offensive on a large scale. I mean, I suppose if the Ukrainians attack and lose terrible casualties in the process, then perhaps Russia would counterattack. But it seems to me that with these not well trained, poor quality troops, the strategy of Russia will probably be to stand on the defensive militarily, to dig in, to rely on artillery above all, to repel Ukrainian attacks, and then basically to try to hold on. And of course, if you're repelling an attack, you don't need troops who are as well trained or as motivated as you do when they're trying to attack and capture positions. So that is my sense of how the near future will look. But as I say, I could be wrong.
Now, in that scenario, eventually Ukraine just virtually runs out of people, right? I don't. Maybe you have a good sense of the casualty levels. I haven't seen any numbers I trust on either side, really. But I think they're taking pretty considerable casualties. Eventually, I mean, if Putin can sustain mobilization politically, then Ukraine runs out of troops before Russia does, right? If it's just a war of attrition. And I would think that would be all the more reason that you see more and more political pressure on the Biden administration to provide more and more sophisticated weapons, right? The Ukrainians are going to say, hey, we stopped them. They've still got a lot of our territory. Do you or do you not want to teach them a lesson about transborder aggression? It's within your power to give us X, Y, and Z. I don't know exactly what the weapon systems are. I assume, first of all, there are these long-range missiles that can be launched from the same launchers that do these HIMARS missiles they're launching now. More advanced battle tanks, fighter jets. I mean, don't you see a possibility of that kind of escalation if Russia, as you say, manages to dig in and persevere?
Yes, I think that is a very great risk. If Russia can hang on, then I think you will get an eventual ceasefire. But if Russia looks as if it's going to be completely defeated, by new Western weaponry, then of course there is the risk of a drastic escalation. I don't think Russia would move immediately to the use of nuclear weapons, but I can imagine, a warning shot, a practice shot, extend the bombardment of Ukrainian territory into Poland. I think Russia would be extremely unwilling to do either of those things. A resort to nuclear weapons, because it would just destroy Russia's reputation in the world. It would bring tremendous condemnation. Escalating the war by attacking, NATO supply lines and bases in Poland would point straight towards the US imposition of a no-fly zone and sending in, US aircraft. Now, at that point, we both put the Russian army in Ukraine in a much worse position. We also take a huge leap towards direct war between America and Russia, with the possibility of this turning into a nuclear exchange and destroying both countries.
Well, I would think direct war would be a possible consequence of the use of even a single tactical nuclear weapon as well, leave aside bombing Poland. I mean, if they even launched a nuke at Snake Island for demonstration purposes, I would think they've significantly escalated the chances of a wider war. Don't you think there'd be huge pressure on Biden to get involved in a whole new way.
Yeah, there would. The Russians could reckon that the nerve of the Europeans will crack, especially if we have a hard winter in Europe. But so far, the Europeans have stuck very much to the American line, at least in public.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, it would be a colossal gamble on Russia's part, which is why I don't think they would do this unless they thought that they were already losing and they had no option but escalate or surrender.
Mm-hmm. And if they don't do either of those things, bomb outside of, attack outside of Ukraine or use a nuke, then the pressure on Biden to escalate would be, as we said, the sheer fact of their persistence on Ukrainian territory. Plus, I would think this business of them attacking Ukrainian infrastructure more and more, and even possibly political targets, which I think is not at all improbable, as you suggest, right? I mean, that'll put a lot of pressure on Biden.
Yes, undoubtedly it will. On the other hand, of course, we do have to see how China reacts to all this, because China has come in for so much criticism here in America, but actually it seems to me China has behaved with enormous restraint, partly because they fear Western, especially European sanctions, but also because, after all, they weren't asked about this war. They deeply disapprove of separatism and changing borders by force. And also, if Russia had won a quick and overwhelming victory, then, Russia would have gained a measure of grudging respect in many parts of the world, including China. But of course, the Chinese don't respect failure, and Russia has experienced failure. But I think all the same, especially after Biden's latest remarks about Taiwan, if the Chinese saw Russia as heading towards complete defeat at the hands of the West, and possibly that in turn leading to a collapse of the Russian state, then the pressure on the Chinese government to send vastly increased aid to Russia would, I think, become overwhelming, because otherwise China would find itself really very seriously isolated on the world stage. And it would also give up a large part of its energy security, and there would be complicated consequences as far as the Belt and Road are concerned. So I'm sure that China doesn't want to get more closely involved, but they may feel they have no choice.
Well, they're uniquely positioned to exert real leverage on Russia, right?
Yes, but I mean, but once again, I mean, leverage to do what? There's no point in putting pressure on Russia, to offer a peace deal to the West, only for the West to either throw it back in their faces or, refer it to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I wonder, what do you think the Biden administration hopes is going to happen? What's their idea of the happy outcome? And in a way, my question is, what has it ever been? Because it seems to me, if you assume, and none of us were assuming this, but if you assume the initial Russian invasion fails, and of course, most of us weren't assuming quite the ambition it had. In other words, a real regime change operation that approaches Kyiv and so on. But once that had failed, I guess it seems to me that something like where we are became almost inevitable in a way. Does that, because then Russia's going to really, once that's failed, it's really going to want to take all the territory it can. It has appreciable force no matter how much it screws up. Biden is committed to not letting it do that. So we're going to kind of provide the Ukrainians with more, whatever kind of weapons it takes, and escalate the weapons provision to keep Russia from making radical progress. And of course, failure is politically unacceptable to Putin. So he's going to do something dramatic. Turns out it's partial mobilization, along with increasingly hitting infrastructure targets. I mean, it just seems to me in retrospect, it's been kind of inevitable that we'd be in a mess. And I don't know now what Biden sees as the welcome end game, the welcome outcome. And I don't know what they ever did in a way. Ever since they were really not going very far in negotiations, even before the invasion, they just didn't seem up for that. And I wonder what preferable outcome did they envision? And I'm still kind of confused. Do you know what they're hoping for at this point?
Not really. I mean, the Biden administration, since first coming to power, has tried consistently to kick the Russian problem down the road without actually resolving anything. Because to try to resolve things would take considerable moral courage and would expend a lot of political capital in Washington. And they've never been willing to do that, even if they had the vision, to seek an agreement. And I think that is still the case. I mean, intelligent ones in private recognize that for Ukraine to try to get Crimea back would be a really, really worrying scenario, given likely Russian reactions. But they will not come out with a peace proposal of their own. And the more they say that this is purely a matter for the Ukrainians, once again, I mean, they're painting with every statement from the administration along those lines, they're painting themselves further into a corner, which is more difficult to get out from. This has been the story of every administration since Clinton in the 1990s, despite repeated warnings from Russia experts, ambassadors to Moscow. The feeling has been, the Russians can't do anything serious. Let's ignore them. Let's, make nice noises. Well, now, of course, nobody's making nice noises, but and basically hope they just go away, because in the end they'll have to accept whatever we do. That played a great part in bringing about this war.
Yeah. What kind of peace deal do you imagine was doable kind of, weeks and weeks before the war? I mean, as an invasion this massive approaches, the context is constantly shifting. Increasingly, the invaders are committed to the invasion, and it's probably going to get harder to call it off. But if you imagine that the Biden administration and the Ukrainians had begun negotiating in earnest, say in December, when it became very clear that we had a quite likely invasion on our hands, what deal do you think, and of course we're all guessing when we talk about these things, but what deal do you imagine there's a pretty good chance you could have gotten with the Russians?
Well, obviously a treaty of neutrality. I mean, Zelensky has said this himself, but only unfortunately after the beginning of the war. He went to NATO governments and asked for. Sorry, one second. Sorry, my writer fell. And asked for a guarantee that Ukraine would be admitted to NATO within 5 years, and they all said no. So Zelensky said, "Okay, so at that point, why not a treaty of neutrality with sufficient international guarantees?" The sad thing was that Zelensky, did not offer that before the war. Well, the reason is he couldn't. He was under too much pressure from his own hardliners, but the West could have offered it. Because, as all these people, as Michael McFaul is now saying, oh, no, we never really intended to bring Ukraine into NATO. Well, why not say so? Because if the West had made a concession like that, I think it would have been very difficult if Russia had got its biggest single demand then to have launched the invasion. And then, there were other things. The Russians demanded then, I think it's still an official demand, though they haven't elaborated it, denazification. Why not say that, in order to make progress towards the West and European Union, Ukraine had to withdraw the laws which had been introduced, basically abolishing the Russian language from public life in Ukraine in the couple of years leading to the war.
Now, is that a fair statement of what the laws were?
Pretty much. Yeah, in intention. Of course, in practice, they'd made only very limited progress because the Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to implement it. But certainly, if you read the laws, the absolutely clear intention, was progressively to drive the Russian language from public life in Ukraine.
You mean like on the literally public life, like in public proceedings? And I mean, I know there was this law that in any town, even a town full of Russian speakers, and there are plenty of those towns in Ukraine, as a technical matter, because of some law they passed, if you're a shopkeeper and a person walks in the store, you're not allowed to greet them in Russian unless they request that you address them in Russian. Now, I don't know if this was enforced, but it's on the books. And I know there are things like that. And I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate that there are a lot of native Russian speakers in Ukraine who feel that they were being systematically oppressed under the Ukrainian government. But anyway, go ahead with what you were saying.
So there were those two things. And then, in the first year of the Biden administration, on Crimea, well, ever since, Russia annexed it in 2014, every Western official I know admitted in private, but only in private, of course, Crimea is gone, Ukraine will never get it back. Well, why not have the courage then actually to look for a solution to this with democratic cover? Tom Graham, former American number 2 in Moscow, said this. That before the war, the only way out is a reference to democracy, local democracy. Just ask the local people, but under, of course, proper international controls, the United Nations, right, what they want. And there's a perfectly reasonable deal, I think, to be done, a quid pro quo with Moscow, whereby Moscow recognizes the independence of Kosovo. And you have a UN-supervised deal in a referendum in Kosovo, which, of course, naturally leads to a vote for independence there. But, it's partly our accursed self-righteousness. You said this to Western diplomats, and they'd say, oh, but there's absolutely no parallel, no legitimate parallel at all between Crimea and Kosovo. And you'd say, well, why not? And they say, well, it's just completely different. Why is it different? Well, it just is. It's different. You get the general idea.
Yeah.
But then you see on the Donbass and the Minsk II agreement of 2015, whereby the Donbass was supposed to return to Ukraine in return for guarantees of full autonomy. That was, in my view, an entirely reasonable deal. It's the kind of thing, well, the US did endorse it, but certainly as a compromise peace agreement, it's the kind of thing that we would have endorsed in, I don't know, we did endorse in the case of northern Sri Lanka. We'd endorse in the case of Myanmar. Any of these, we basically did it.
And if we can drill down on that, just one thing. So I gather Minsk II would have been, in a way, leaving aside even whether there was an explicit agreement that Ukraine would never join NATO, Minsk II would have been kind of a backdoor way of ensuring that, right? Because it would have given these two provinces effective veto power over major foreign policy initiatives or something, right? So now, do you have a view on who's responsible for the failure of Minsk II? The Russians say Ukraine just never tried to do it in good faith. I assume Ukraine says the reverse. Do you know how exactly Minsk II, which was, of course, negotiated after the 2014 revolution coup, whatever you want to call it, right? Do you have a sense for how Minsk II fell apart?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely obvious. The Ukrainian parliament and government refused to pass the legislation guaranteeing the Donbass full autonomy permanently. No, that's entirely obvious. Now, the reason they did it is why they refused to do that is what you've just said, that they thought that an autonomous Donbass within Ukraine would act as a block on progress towards membership of NATO. But you see, when talking to people of American officials after the Biden administration came in, you got a recognition that Crimea would never return to Ukraine. You got a recognition that for the foreseeable future, Ukraine would not be a member of NATO because this implied war with Russia and because the French and Germans opposed it. You also got people saying, oh, of course, Minsk is dead. But in none of these cases where they prepared to come out in public was the administration prepared to come out and say, okay, Minsk is dead, what's our alternative? Because they didn't have one. They recognized that Crimea would never go back, but they weren't prepared to bite the bullet and say, okay, let's make a reasonable deal on Crimea. And even though they knew that NATO membership was not a possibility, they weren't prepared to do a deal with Russia that would have averted war. So, I mean, it was a pretty disgraceful picture, frankly, of of irresponsibility and moral cowardice. And as I want to write a piece about this, saying that everybody always makes over and over and over and over again a parallel to 1939. Because that implies the other side is absolutely evil and all responsibility for the war is on one side. I see it much more like 1914. One can well agree, including most Germans by now, that Germany was principally responsible for the outbreak of war in 1914. But that doesn't mean you ignore or excuse, for example, the criminal folly of the Russian government in basically giving a blank check to Serbia, to pursue its nationalist aims in the Balkans, with no effective control. So just because obviously, I mean, in the end, it was the decision of the Russian government to invade Ukraine, and it was an utterly criminal and irresponsible decision. But you cannot, ignore the fact that the West and European countries and America, failed to do a whole set of things that they should have done to try to avert this catastrophe.
So let's round out what would have been the peace deal that might have worked before the war, before we jump ahead and ask how much worse than that would any peace deal we could get now be. So let's imagine you've got, let's say you do both Minsk II and for good measure, the explicit guarantee by NATO of no Ukrainian membership. You agree that in Crimea there will be an internationally supervised election to determine the will of the people, and the same will happen in Kosovo. And Russia's not going to like the result of that election, but they'd agree to it. Then the remaining question is the Donbass, the separatist-held territory. What would have happened there? And of course, that had been a fierce battle line, I think, more than a lot of Americans appreciate all along. There was a war going on, in a sense, before the invasion, and that contributed to it. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, my sense is that if Russia had got, at least this is who can one believe? But I've been told by Russian officials that if they could have, got agreements on other things, and some sort of commitment or recommitment in principle to the Minsk process, that they would have been willing once again to kick Minsk down the road. Now, I can't guarantee that is the case, but it seems plausible that if they got basically 2 or 3 out of their 4 key demands.
But I mean, does the separatist-held territory remain separatist-held in that scenario? It is not really under the governance of Kyiv?
Well, yes, because I mean, the only way it was ever going to go back, short of Ukraine reconquering it, was on the basis of guaranteed autonomy. I mean,
which is Minsk II, which I would think, if I were in Kyiv, I'd prefer that to an ongoing civil war, but that's just me.
Well, the stupid thing is, that before the war, I mean, before 2014, even actually more extreme Ukrainian nationalists would say in private, or occasionally even in public, look, for God's sake, let the Donbass, the whole of the Donbass and Crimea go, because they are, an albatross around our necks. They are a means of Russian pressure. They will never agree to the extension of Ukrainian language laws. There's a permanent threat of rebellion. Let them go, and we will be much stronger, much more homogeneous, and much more able, both to turn the country towards our vision of an ethnic Ukrainian state, and much more able to move towards the West. It should be remembered that not that we started out by backing this, but we have got into the curious position of backing in Ukraine, an ethnic version of Ukrainian nationalism, which everywhere else in the world is something that we say we disapprove of, right?
Right. And just to flesh that out, maybe you should flesh it out just a little bit. What you mean exactly by that? That because I think the way it's reported in the press in the West is, the referendums are a good example. That everyone in these towns actually hates the Russians. They're forcing them to vote, and then they're going to lie about the results. It's actually more complicated than that, right? And it's because we're not seeing the complexity that people don't understand the sense in which this is an ethnic conflict, right? I mean, can you just elaborate a little on that?
Well,
and by the way, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that the results of the referendum will actually be valid. There's so many reasons we've already covered that they won't be. The pro-Ukrainian population has largely left those areas. B, we can't trust the counting of the votes. C, maybe there was compulsion. And D, a lot of the provinces are not even part of the referendum. So anyway, that aside, though, why don't you elaborate on what you mean in the sense in which this remains something of an ethnic conflict?
Well, before 2014, it was absolutely clear, visiting the Donbass and Crimea, that there was, I would say, overwhelming support in Crimea and substantial support in the Donbass for leaving Ukraine and joining Russia. In other Russian-speaking areas of the East and South, it wasn't that people wanted to leave, but they certainly, disapproved of attempts to Ukrainianize their culture and language, and would have liked much more local autonomy, much more. And of course, remember that the 2014 revolution was against the democratically elected president, who was elected with huge majorities in the East and South of the country.
Right.
Well, now, of course, Russia has, in a way, repeated this mistake twice, first on a relatively small scale, and then this year on a colossal scale. But of course, what Russia did by annexing Crimea, supporting rebellion in the Donbass, backing the separatists in war, and then this year their full-scale invasion, has undoubtedly been to drive a lot of people who previously sympathized with Russia into, complete support for the Ukrainian state against Russia. But frankly, what the balance is in the territories occupied by Russia, we just don't know. As you've said quite rightly, we cannot for a second trust the results of these referenda. But since it's impossible to do any serious research on the ground in these areas, and in any case, as you also said, since so much of the population is gone, what a majority of the population today really thinks, we have no idea, really.
Yeah. Okay, so we kind of fleshed out the kind of peace deal you think might have been doable before the war. It certainly would have left no more territory in Russian and or separatist hands than there was before the war. Right. In other words, Crimea and the separatists held part of the Donbass. I assume you think that is no longer possible, right? I cannot imagine Russia saying, "Okay, we'll withdraw troops," and if you'll just give us this one thing, the main thing we were asking for about Ukraine and NATO, we will withdraw troops from all the territory they have gained at great cost. I would think that that's politically undoable for Putin. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Well, if they annex these territories,
Yeah, but leave that aside. I mean, assume magically peace negotiations started tomorrow, or they started before the referenda. Even it just seems to me that a long time ago we passed the day where we could realistically return to the status quo ante and get the peace deal we could have had before the war. But I hope I'm wrong. But what do you think?
On balance, I think you're probably right. I mean, and certainly, I mean, Russia could not, withdraw from the territories it's occupied without its own security guarantees. There would have to be a demilitarized zone, because otherwise the Russians would simply be afraid, the Ukrainians would use this as a springboard to resume the war. And I mean, if one went back to Russia's initial demands, which are still there theoretically on the table, and the Ukrainian offer in March, which went some considerable distance towards meeting those, then in principle, in a rational world, which we do not inhabit, there would be a possibility, I think, of peace. And of course, the incentive on the Russian side is that they have lost so many men. They have failed to gain their major objectives. They haven't even conquered the whole of the Donbass. And they've suffered, twice now, very serious defeats on the ground. Well, reality exists. And it's clear from, the Russian responses that they have enormously scaled back their ambitions because of these defeats. Mm-hmm. And, in the end, if they think they're going to lose in the long run, or are going to have to recruit so many people as to cause, really deep unhappiness at home, and face, a future of prolonged economic decline, then I know Russians who would, including establishment Russians, who would be prepared to accept a compromise. But I don't know, among people in the Russian establishment, or indeed the great majority of ordinary Russians I know, I don't know anyone who would be prepared to accept surrender, which is now, the Ukrainian demand. In other words, give up Crimea, give up the Eastern Donbass, give up everything.
That seems to me crazy talk.
Well, but it is the Ukrainian government which is saying it, and the Biden administration is saying peace talks are entirely a matter for the Ukrainians.
Right.
So, I mean, it's crazy talk, but it is official talk. And that's obviously what what Putin has been listening to. If he moves to annexation, it will be because he has given up completely on the idea of peace talks. And then, we're, well, at best, there's going to be a long slogging match. At worst, we escalate, towards potential nuclear cataclysm. Yeah. I mean, it's very strange, Bob. We both are, I suppose, of a certain age. I mean, we remember when the fear of nuclear war was a real thing.
I remember.
Yeah. And people, and people remembered how close we came in the Cuban Missile Crisis, even if they didn't actually know just how close, we came. Now you've got these people who basically shrug it off, saying, it's all empty bluff. Putin will blink. Putin's not serious. The same people will then say, but we can't. There's no point in trying to negotiate with Putin because Putin's irrational. Putin's mad. So Putin is mad, but Putin will blink. Really?
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of ironies in the American... within the blob. There are ironies within the blob. So let's see. So the hope, I guess, at this point is that come Friday, Putin will say, I've decided to put off the decision on annexation. Let's think about this, make sure we know what we're doing. That is a signal that he's open to negotiation. I mean, conceivably, you can imagine if I were writing the script for this, the Biden administration might signal under the table between now and Friday that if he did that, we'd be willing to talk in a way we haven't talked. I don't see signs of that happening. I was never optimistic about kind of Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, but I've gotten only less optimistic. So I don't see signs of that happening. Do you rule that out? That there's more going on under the table than we imagine from the American side? And in any event, do you think there's much hope at all of this decision being delayed on Friday in a way that leads to negotiation?
There's an old Russian saying that hope dies last. So, I will go on hoping and praying, frankly, until the last moment that these two things will happen. But no, I'm not optimistic. I mean, the only hope is that the alternatives look so terrifying, frankly.
Yeah, and it isn't just the nuclear thing. It's just the capacity of wars to take unexpected directions and get bigger,
Well, I mean, one thing, and here this, once again, this accursed self-righteousness kicks in. So many people in the West have been complaining bitterly because China has not given us full support against Russia. While, of course, meanwhile, the US president does just about everything in his power to infuriate the Chinese and, make clear that they are next. Now, of course, I mean, there are good practical reasons for China not to support Russia. I mean, because they are afraid of sanctions before they're ready for them, that they're trying to get ready. They're not ready yet. And, of course, because they didn't approve the war. Russia didn't ask them, and Russia has failed. I mean, I think there's much respect for Russia left in Beijing. But on the other hand, especially after Biden's last remarks, given, the tone of the American media and establishment, which the Chinese are perfectly capable of reading, but also the fact that if the Chinese become convinced that the American agenda, is drastically to weaken Russia, to impose a total defeat on Russia, leading to a fall of the regime and, potentially the collapse of the Russian state. I mean, that would have really drastic implications for China. China would be largely isolated internationally. China's energy security would be very badly affected. And I think China would imagine that having done that, American hardliners would be enormously emboldened, against China if you managed to finish off Russia in this way. So, I mean, if the Chinese do decide to take the risk of sanctions, they are, of course, in a position massively to strengthen Russia, both militarily, not with Chinese troops. They will never send Chinese people to fight in Ukraine, but they can, of course, provide huge numbers of weapons. Right. I mean, two can play that game. We're running a proxy war in Ukraine. The Chinese can do the same. Huge amounts of weapons and economic aid to Russia. People seem enormously confident that will never happen. I mean, I have no idea why they're so confident. I'm not.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess we're not ending this in much better a mood than we started in, Anatol. I don't think motivational speaker is maybe your career path. I'm sorry. I'd like to say I'm going to have a new skip in my step after talking to you, but no.
Well, you remember old Gramsci? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Okay, I'll think about that. Does that work? Does that formula work?
Not really.
No.
Best we have.
Okay, well, that was intellectual pessimism you gave us there at the very, very end. Well, thank you, Anatol. People can find you on Twitter, right? The names are reversed. It's Lieven. What is it? @Lieven_ Anatol? Is that it? You don't know. Anyway, the name is...
Anyway, they can find me.
They can find you. Everything is findable in the modern world.
But also, of course, I have to advertise for my institute. If you go to Quincy Institute, you can find all my pieces for the Quincy
Right.
there, along with lots of other brilliant stuff from the restraint point of view.
Right.
At Quincy Institute.
And responsible statecraft is kind of the media arm of Quincy, I guess, separate from the site itself, though. And you've got pieces there. So, and you got this piece in The Guardian on If Putin Falls. And so we encourage people to read all that. Thanks so much for taking the time, Anatol.
It was a pleasure, Bob. Thank you so much.
Okay.